The fluorescent lights in the emergency room had a particular quality that Daniel Reeves had come to understand over the years. Not bright exactly, more like relentless, the kind of light that refused to let anything hide. It found the lines in people's faces, it found the blood on his cuff, it found the small crack running across the face of the watch on his left wrist, and it found the inscription inside when the nurse gently folded back his sleeve to check his pulse. He pulled the sleeve back down himself before she could read it. "Sir, I need to—" "I know." He let her take his pulse at the wrist above the watch instead. His right forearm was already wrapped in the temporary gauze the paramedic had applied at the scene, and the attending physician was somewhere behind a curtain dictating notes into a recorder. The clock on the wall read 3:14 in the morning. Outside, through the narrow strip of window above the waiting area chairs, Baltimore was dark and wet and indifferent. The nurse wrote something on her clipboard. She had the practiced calm of someone who had seen everything this city produced after midnight, and she did not ask him what had happened. That was either professional discretion or simple exhaustion. Daniel didn't ask which. He had been sitting in this particular chair for 22 minutes. He knew because he checked the watch every few minutes the way a man checks a wound. Not because he expected anything to change, but because the act of checking was itself a kind of discipline. Angela had given him the watch 2 weeks before she died. She'd had it engraved herself, sneaking it out of the drawer where he kept it while he was downstairs making her soup she couldn't eat anymore. He hadn't known about the inscription until the morning of the funeral, when her sister pressed the box into his hands outside the church and said, without explanation, that Angela had asked her to hold it until that day, run toward it. He had worn it every day since. 3 years, 4 months, and 11 days. The attending physician appeared from behind the curtain, a compact woman in her 40s with reading glasses pushed up onto her forehead like a second pair of eyes. She looked at the temporary dressing, then at Daniel's face, then at the dressing again. 8 stitches, she said, not as a question. The laceration is clean but deep. You have good range of motion, which means it missed anything important. You were lucky. Daniel nodded. He had been hearing that word applied to him for most of his adult life, but in contexts that made him question what the alternative looked like. Do you want to tell me how this happened? Not particularly. She studied him for a moment with the particular expression of someone deciding whether to push. She decided not to. She wrote the prescription for antibiotics, gave him the aftercare instructions with the tone of someone who suspected he wouldn't follow all of them, and told him the stitches should come out in 10 to 12 days. He thanked her and walked out into the Baltimore night. The rain had eased to a mist by the time he reached the parking lot. He stood beside his truck, a 2009 Ford F-150, with a dent in the rear quarter panel that he kept meaning to fix and never did, and looked up at the sky. In Afghanistan, the sky at night had been incomprehensible, so full of stars that it felt like a physical weight pressing down. Baltimore's sky was mostly orange from the light pollution, a low ceiling of reflected glow. He had spent a long time after coming home missing that sky. Then he had spent a long time not thinking about what else he missed from over there, and gradually those two things had merged into each other until it became easier not to look up at all. He got in the truck. The clock on the dashboard read 3:31. Imani would wake at 7. He had enough time to get home, shower, and make breakfast before she came padding out in her socks asking if there were eggs. He drove east through empty streets past the shuttered storefronts and the all-night laundromats in the corner where the Korean grocery store had operated for 30 years before closing last spring, its windows now papered over with notices. He had shopped there. Angela had shopped there. He didn't let himself think about that for long. He had moved to Baltimore East Side the year he got out of the Army, following Angela, who had grown up 8 blocks from where they now lived. She had wanted to be close to her mother, and then her mother had died 3 weeks after they moved in. and Angela had cried for 2 days and then stood up and said, "Well, we're here now," with the particular finality of someone accepting a decision that could no longer be unmade. That was the quality he had loved most about her. Not the optimism which was real, but the pragmatism underneath it, the ability to absorb the worst thing and then simply continue. She had taught him that, or retaught it. The army had given him a version of it that was more about suppression than acceptance, more about loading and unloading the weight rather than learning to carry it differently. Angela's version had been better. He pulled into the parking spot behind their building and sat in the truck for a moment with the engine off. From here he could see the light in Ruth Okafor's window. She lived in the unit directly across the interior courtyard, and she left a lamp on all night because, as she had once told him, she had learned to sleep with light when her husband was sick and dying, and she needed to see that nothing had changed when she startled awake at 2 in the morning. The habit had outlasted the reason for it by 8 years. Daniel found the light comforting in a way he had never said aloud. He went upstairs quietly, removed his jacket in the hallway, and checked on Imani before doing anything else. She was asleep on her back with one arm thrown over her eyes as though blocking out a sun that wasn't there. Her stuffed elephant, an object of such profound sentimental gravity that it had its own established protocol for car trips and doctor's visits, was pressed against her side. Her breathing was steady. Daniel stood in the doorway and counted 3 full breaths before he allowed himself to move. The inhaler was on her nightstand, where it always was. He checked it anyway. In the bathroom, he unwrapped the temporary dressing and looked at the stitches in the overhead light. The physician had been right about the laceration. Clean, deep, perpendicular to the grain of the muscle. It would scar. He had enough scars that one more registered as information rather than distress. He rewrapped it carefully, showered with his arm above the waterline, and changed into the clothes he kept folded on the bathroom shelf because the bedroom now belonged entirely to Imani, and he had never gotten around to reorganizing that arrangement. He made coffee. He sat at the kitchen table. The table was small, 4 chairs that only fit comfortably when 2 were pushed in, and it occupied the center of the kitchen the way a table occupied a kitchen when a kitchen was also a dining room and an office. And the place where a man sat alone at 4 in the morning reconstructing the night he'd just had. There was a notepad on the table with figures written in his handwriting. He looked at them without needing to recalculate. $156 in checking. Tomorrow was Imani's refill day. The Flovent inhaler, $138 after the insurance adjustment that had been adjusted upward at the start of the year, without notice. $870 in rent due in 12 days. He had been keeping the math in his head for 2 weeks, running it and rerunning it the way you ran a route looking for a different outcome that the terrain wasn't going to provide. In the drawer beside the stove were 2 Amtrak tickets to Portland, Maine. Round trip, Baltimore to Portland, purchased 5 months ago when he'd seen a sale fare and made a decision that had felt, at the time, like hope rather than recklessness. Imani had never met her grandmother. Angela's mother had moved north after the funeral because, as she had written in a letter, she could not live in a city where her daughter was everywhere and nowhere. The tickets were for July, non-refundable. He had been putting away $11 a week since January to buy them, which meant they represented $55 of savings that had taken 5 months to accumulate and could not now be recovered. He opened the drawer and looked at them. Then he closed the drawer. He had been doing the math for 2 weeks because 2 weeks ago he had been informed during a routine dental checkup for Imani that he had put off 3 times already, that she had the early presentation of a bite misalignment that would require orthodontic intervention. Not now, the dentist said, when her permanent teeth were fully in. In 2 to 3 years. He had nodded and driven home and run the numbers that night and every night since. which was the period of his life that had led directly to tonight's events and their financial aftermath. Though not in any linear way he could have predicted. He had taken the job at Nexus Warehouse Complex 14 months ago, after the security company where he'd worked for 2 years was bought out by a larger firm that restructured its staffing and eliminated his position with 4 weeks' notice, and a handshake from an HR representative who had clearly given the same handshake many times that month. The Nexus job paid $41,200 annually, which was less than the security position but more consistent in its hours. The shift was 10 at night to 6 in the morning, which meant he could walk Imani to school at 8:15 and be there when she got home at 3. The middle of the day he slept, when Imani was at school and the apartment was quiet except for the sound of the street below. It was not a glamorous arrangement. It required Ruth Okafor to come over at 9:30 every evening and stay until he left at 10, sitting on the couch watching her game shows with Imani, until the child fell asleep and Ruth turned off the television and sat in the armchair with her book. Ruth refused payment with a consistency that bordered on aggression. She had told him once and only once that Angela had sat with her every night for 6 weeks after Ruth's husband died, bringing soup and saying nothing useful and being present in the way that presence matters most when words are inadequate, and that the debt ran in a direction he didn't need to worry about. He had learned, slowly and against his instincts, to accept that. The job itself suited him in ways he hadn't expected. There was a particular satisfaction in work that had clear parameters and visible results. A floor that was dirty and then clean, a trash can that was full and then empty, a corridor that smelled of industrial solvent and effort. Nobody watched him do it. Nobody assessed his performance against quarterly metrics or asked him to participate in team-building exercises. His supervisor, Gary Novak, was a compact man with a permanent expression of low-grade anxiety, who mostly communicated via handwritten notes left in the supply closet, and who had, in 14 months, spoken to Daniel about something other than logistics exactly twice. Once to ask if Daniel's military background gave him any insight into whether a strange ticking sound in the warehouse HVAC system was worth worrying about. And once to tell him, on a Wednesday afternoon, that his performance reviews had been consistently satisfactory. Daniel had thanked him. Gary had nodded and gone back to his office. The night of April 14th began like every other. Daniel clocked in at 9:57, 3 minutes early as was his habit, collected his cart from the supply room and started his route. Warehouse 3 first, then the loading dock restrooms, then the long connecting corridor between buildings 5 through 8. Warehouse 7 last, because the break room was there and he always saved his sandwich for the end of the shift when the night was almost over, and the effort of eating felt proportional to the reward. The rain started around midnight, not gradual, sudden, the way spring rain in Baltimore sometimes arrived with no preliminary drizzle, just a shift from dry to drowning. He could hear it hammering the corrugated metal of the warehouse roof while he worked, and he thought, as he sometimes did in weather like this, about the way rain in the Korengal Valley had sounded different, denser, slower. He shut that door in his mind with the practiced efficiency of long habit. By 2 in the morning, he had finished the loading dock restrooms and was in the main corridor, the mop moving in the steady figure-8 pattern that covered the most ground with the least wasted motion. The fluorescent lights overhead made their permanent low-frequency buzz. The corridor smelled of ammonia and standing water and the ghost of 1,000 cigarette breaks taken just outside the emergency exit 40 feet away. He was wringing out the mop when he heard it. Not loud, not close, but distinct in the way that certain sounds cut through ambient noise because they carry a frequency the human body recognizes before the mind can classify it. A woman's scream, not surprised but terrified, the kind that comes from deep in the chest cavity when the body understands that what is happening is serious and the understanding hasn't reached the throat yet, so it escapes as pure signal. Daniel's hands stopped moving. In the time it took him to set the mop handle against the wall and turn in the direction of the sound, his mind had already done the calculation it had been trained to do: direction, distance, structural layout, possible access points. The sound had come from the exterior, somewhere near or behind Warehouse 7, in the shadow corridor between buildings where the security lighting coverage was incomplete. He had noticed the gap the first week on the job and had submitted a maintenance request that had, as far as he knew, been entered into a system and forgotten. He was running before he had consciously decided to run. His boots hit the wet pavement outside the emergency exit, and he turned the corner of Warehouse 5 at a pace that his shoulder registered with its familiar protest. The old AC joint injury that had never quite resolved, and that announced itself in cold or wet weather like a creditor who had learned exactly when to call. He ignored it. The angle of the rain hit him sideways, and he lowered his head and covered the 60 yards between Building 5 and Building 7 in the time it took him to breathe 5 times. He came around the corner of Warehouse 7 and saw them. 2 men, 1 woman. The woman was pressed against the corrugated wall, her back flat against the metal, one heel broken off her shoe so that she listed slightly to the left in a way that would have been almost comic under different circumstances. The man on her right had one hand over her mouth and the other gripping her upper arm. And even from 20 feet away, Daniel could see the rigidity in her body, the absolute stillness of someone who has calculated that movement will make things worse. The second man was crouched over the contents of her purse, which had been emptied onto the wet ground: a phone, a wallet, keys, lip gloss rolling slowly toward a puddle. The man with his hand over the woman's mouth turned at the sound of Daniel's footsteps. In the light that reached them from the distant security lamp, Daniel saw the knife in his right hand, not the right hand on the woman's mouth, the other one, the free one, the one that had been hanging loose and casual at his side until the moment it was needed. He knew the knife, 6-inch blade, hunting style, full tang. He had seen it on a belt hook once in a break room at a different site, on a different shift when the man wearing it had been eating a sandwich and complaining about the mold inspection that had shut down half the second floor. He knew the man. Troy Odom had worked as a contract security guard at Nexus Warehouse Complex until 3 months ago, when the company terminated his contract without the 2-week severance payment stipulated in the agreement he had signed. Daniel knew this because Troy had told him in the parking lot the afternoon of his last shift. Leaning against the hood of his car with the particular flatness of someone who had used up all his anger and was now running on the residue. They had spoken maybe 4 times in 14 months, passing conversation in the break room, 2 brief exchanges in the parking lot. Daniel knew Troy had a daughter the same age as Imani, that he was behind on rent, and that he had accepted the Nexus contract because it paid more than the last job and the hiring process had been quick. He did not know Troy well, but he knew his face and Troy knew his, and in the space of a second they were looking at each other across 20 feet of wet pavement with the full weight of that recognition between them. Troy's eyes flickered. Not guilt exactly. Something more complicated than guilt, less clean. The expression of a man who had arrived at a destination he had never intended to reach and was now standing in it. Daniel took a step forward. "Let her go." His voice came out at the register he had learned to use when the situation required something that was not a request. It didn't shake. It didn't escalate. It simply landed in the space between them with the weight of a statement that expected compliance. Troy's companion, younger, thinner, with the jittery energy of someone running on something chemical, backed toward his partner, the phone from the woman's purse clutched in his hand. "Troy, come on, let's go, let's just—" Troy didn't move. The hand over the woman's mouth tightened slightly, and she made a muffled sound that was not quite a scream and not quite a word, but contained all the information either could carry. Daniel took another step. "Now." What happened in the next 40 seconds existed for him afterward not as a sequence of memories but as a series of still images. The way action compressed in moments of genuine danger into frames that the mind stored separately, to be assembled later in whatever order made them most useful. Troy releasing the woman and turning toward Daniel, the knife coming up and forward in an upward slash that was faster than it should have been from a man who had seemed until a second ago uncertain. Daniel's left hand catching the wrist, not cleanly, the angle wrong because his shoulder had given him half a second less range than he needed. The blade catching his forearm, the hot sensation that was not yet pain, just heat and pressure, and the understanding that the cut was real but not catastrophic. His knee finding Troy's midsection with enough force to empty the air from it, the knife clattering across wet concrete, Troy's fist connecting with the side of his head. The stars that followed not disabling but present, the kind of stars that informed you that you were in a fight rather than the kind that ended it. The younger man's footsteps already receding, Troy coming at him again, hands going for his throat, and Daniel ducking under the reach, driving his elbow into the ribs, sweeping the legs. A combination that worked not because it was elegant but because his body had run it 10,000 times in training, and it did not require conscious thought to execute. Troy on the wet concrete, face down. Daniel's knee between his shoulder blades. The woman against the wall, not running, watching him with eyes that were wide and dark and still full of the adrenaline that had nowhere to go. He looked at her across the distance. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" She shook her head, a small, rapid motion. "Do you have a phone?" She reached into her coat pocket with hands that were not entirely steady. "Call 911. Tell them Nexus Warehouse Complex, the south side between buildings 5 and 7. Can you do that?" She was already dialing. The police arrived in 9 minutes, which Daniel knew because he was watching the watch. He gave his statement in the clipped, factual sentences that were the native register of anyone who had written enough military reports. Name, occupation, time of incident, sequence of events, injuries observed and sustained. He told them about the knife and its approximate dimensions. He did not tell them that he recognized Troy Odom from the job site, not because he intended to conceal it, but because it hadn't seemed in the moment like information the responding officers needed in order to process the scene. An officer asked twice whether he wanted to be transported for medical attention. Daniel told him it was a surface laceration and he had worse in basic. The officer noted this in his report with the expression of someone who believed him and was also not entirely sure believing him was wise. The woman, she had given her name to the officers as Petra Harlow, was escorted to a police vehicle on the north side of the building. One of the officers came back to tell Daniel that she had asked about him. He said to tell her he was glad she was safe. He meant it. By the time the police finished with him, 2 hours of his shift had elapsed. He went back inside, collected his mop from the corridor where he had left it, and worked until 6 in the morning, moving carefully to favor the arm. The cleaning solution stung when it found the edge of the temporary dressing. He adjusted his grip and continued. He was sitting at this kitchen table the following evening. Imani had gone to sleep an hour early, worn out from a school field trip to the aquarium, and Ruth had gone home after leaving a container of jollof rice in the refrigerator with a post-it note that said simply, "Eat this," when Gary Novak called and asked if Daniel could come in early. Not to his shift, to his office. The office was a small room off the main corridor with the lived-in quality of a space that its occupant had never fully claimed. A desk, 2 chairs, a filing cabinet with 1 drawer that didn't close all the way, and 3 motivational posters on the wall that had been there since before Gary's tenure. Teamwork, excellence, integrity. The words were in a font that had been fashionable 15 years ago and had not aged especially well. Gary was standing when Daniel arrived, which was unusual. He did not gesture toward the second chair. His hands were at his sides, and he was looking at a point slightly to the left of Daniel's face in the way that people looked when they were preparing to say something they wished someone else was saying. He had the envelope on the desk already. Daniel looked at it. He looked at Gary. He did not speak. "Corporate reviewed the security footage," Gary said, "from the night before last." The words had the quality of something rehearsed but not fully memorized, the pauses slightly wrong. "The incident with the woman and the 2 men outside warehouse 7. Daniel waited. "They're terminating your employment." Gary's voice had dropped in volume, as though saying it quietly might change what it meant. "Post-abandonment, unauthorized physical intervention on company property, liability exposure." He exhaled through his nose. "It's in the handbook, Section 12, subsection B. Employees are not to engage in any—" "Gary," Daniel's voice was even, "I stopped 2 men from assaulting a woman." Gary's jaw worked. He was looking at the desk now. "I know. She was being held against a wall with a knife at— I know what happened." And something in his voice then, beneath the rehearsed compliance, had the sound of a man who was not entirely unaware of what he was participating in. "They're not disputing what happened. They're disputing the method. They reviewed the footage and they—" He stopped. He picked up the envelope and held it out. Daniel didn't take it immediately. He looked at the integrity poster on the wall behind Gary's head, the word in its motivational font surrounded by a photograph of a mountain. "The footage," he said. "Which footage did they use?" Gary's hand with the envelope dropped slightly. Something shifted in his expression. "They didn't use the footage of me leaving my station." Daniel watched Gary's face confirm what he had already suspected. "They used the footage of me coming back, of me wrapping my arm and going back to work." Gary said nothing. "They used the footage of me finishing my shift to prove I knowingly accepted the risk." The math of it was almost elegant in the way that institutional self-protection was sometimes elegant, efficient, airtight, and entirely backward. "They took the thing that was closest to what I was supposed to do and used it as evidence that I did something wrong." Gary set the envelope on the desk between them. He sat down. He put his hands flat on the desk and looked at them. Daniel picked up the envelope. He didn't open it. "Your final check is in there," Gary said to his hands. "They included 2 weeks' severance. $612 after taxes." He had already calculated it. He stood in the small office with the envelope in his right hand, and his stitched arm at his side, and the integrity poster on the wall above Gary's bowed head. And he thought about Imani asleep in the apartment 3 miles east. One arm over her eyes, the elephant pressed against her side, breathing the steady, reliable breaths that the medication made possible. He thought about the 2 tickets in the kitchen drawer. He thought about Ruth's post-it note on the container in the refrigerator. "You're a decent man, Gary." He put the envelope in his jacket pocket. "I don't hold this against you." He turned and walked out before Gary could respond. He heard the man exhale behind him, a long, pressured sound like something that had been held too long finally being released. Daniel didn't turn around. The walk home took 40 minutes. He knew faster routes, but he took the longer one because he needed the time and the movement and the night air, which had dried out since the previous evening's rain and carried the first genuine warmth of the season, the smell of wet earth and diesel and the distant hint of the harbor. He ran the numbers as he walked. He had been running them since the moment Gary said the word terminating. By the time he reached his building, he had run them 6 times and reached the same conclusion each time. He had enough for Imani's medication, which was the only line item that was non-negotiable. Everything else was negotiable, which was another way of saying that everything else was in trouble. He went upstairs, checked on Imani, made coffee. At the table, he pulled the 2 train tickets out of the drawer and set them beside the notepad with the figures. He looked at both for a long time. The tickets to Portland, non-refundable. The numbers that didn't add up. The handwriting on the notepad that was his and Angela's at the same time, because he had learned her habit of working out money problems by writing them down instead of just carrying them in his head, and he had never stopped. He picked up the watch from where he'd set it on the table while he calculated. He always took it off when he wrote, some old habit whose origin he couldn't trace, and held it in his palm. The crack in the crystal face had happened 6 months ago when he'd set it down too hard on the bathroom sink, and he kept meaning to have it repaired and kept not doing it, partly because he didn't want to take it off long enough to have it serviced, and partly because the crack had become, in some way he hadn't fully articulated even to himself, part of the watch now. He turned it over, read the inscription in the kitchen light, run toward it. A. In the apartment's silence, with the coffee going cold in the mug and the numbers on the notepad and the tickets to Portland and the medical bill for the stitches he would receive in 3 days in the mail. He whispered something to the empty room that was not quite a prayer and not quite a complaint. It was more like a report, the kind of report you gave at the end of a very long mission to the person who had sent you on it. Honest about the conditions and the costs and the status of everything you'd been asked to protect. Then he set the watch back on his wrist, buckled the strap, and stood up. Imani would wake at 7. There were eggs in the refrigerator and bread on the counter and enough left from Ruth's jollof rice that he wouldn't have to make anything complicated. The prescription refill was tomorrow and he would manage the money and the rent and the rest of it, because he had been managing exactly this kind of math for 3 years. And he had not yet found a version of it that couldn't be solved, only versions that cost more than expected. He washed the coffee mug. He turned off the kitchen light. In the darkness of the hallway, standing outside Imani's cracked open door, he could hear her breathing. Steady, clear, the medication doing its work. He stood there for a moment in the dark with his hand against the doorframe and his cracked watch on his wrist and the envelope in his jacket pocket still unopened, and he allowed himself exactly that much. The sound of her breathing, the fact of it, the weight of it as both burden and anchor. Then he went to bed. He did not sleep particularly well, but he slept. Petra Harlow arrived on a Thursday evening 2 days after the termination. Daniel had just put Imani to bed, earlier than usual because the child had been watching him all through dinner with the focused intensity she deployed when she suspected something was wrong and had decided to gather data before asking about it. He had told her he was tired. She had accepted this with the provisional quality of a 7-year-old who knew the difference between tired and something else but was willing to grant a temporary extension on the truth. He was standing at the kitchen sink rinsing the dinner plates when the knock came. Not Ruth's knock. Ruth used 3 short raps, the rhythm of long familiarity. This was 2 knocks, evenly spaced, the knock of someone who had rehearsed the appropriate level of confidence for a situation they weren't entirely certain of. He dried his hands, checked the peephole. She was wearing a coat that was not the same one from the warehouse. This one was charcoal wool, structured at the shoulders. The kind of coat that cost more than his monthly rent and had been chosen by someone who understood that clothing communicated before words did. Her hair was pulled back and she was holding a leather folder against her chest the way people held things when they needed something to do with their hands. She looked, through the distortion of the peephole lens, like a woman who had prepared for this conversation and was now standing at the beginning of it, wondering if preparation had been enough. He opened the door. The recognition moved across her face before she controlled it. The specific expression of someone seeing, in ordinary context and ordinary light, a person they had only previously seen in extraordinary circumstances. She was in her early 30s, he estimated, with the composure of someone who spent significant portions of her professional life in rooms full of people who needed to be managed. The composure had a seam in it tonight. "Mr. Reeves," her voice was steady. "My name is Petra Harlow. I'm the woman from the warehouse. I got your address from the police report." A pause that was its own form of explanation. "I wanted to thank you in person. "May I come in?" He stepped aside. She took in the apartment without the rapid scanning assessment that people sometimes made when they entered spaces smaller than they were accustomed to. She looked around slowly with something closer to attention than judgment. The kitchen table with its 4 chairs, the drawings on the refrigerator held up by alphabet magnets. The 2 tickets to Portland still on the table where he had left them that morning because he hadn't been able to bring himself to put them back in the drawer. He gestured toward the table. She sat. He filled 2 glasses with water from the tap and set one in front of her. She wrapped both hands around it but didn't drink, which was the gesture of someone who appreciated the offering more than the water itself. He sat across from her and waited. "I called Nexus," she said. "Yesterday morning. I wanted to tell them what kind of man they had working for them." The leather folder on the table between them. "That's when I found out what they'd done." Daniel said nothing. "I need you to understand something before I say anything else." She looked at him directly. "What I'm about to propose is not charity. It is not pity. And it is not primarily about you, which I realize sounds like a strange way to begin." He found, despite everything, that this was the thing he had needed to hear first. Most people, when they arrived with something they wanted from him, led with what they were offering. She had led with what this wasn't. She opened the leather folder. Her father was Senator Warren Harlow of Maryland. Daniel knew the name, had seen the yard signs in the neighborhood during the last election cycle, had formed no strong opinion. For 4 years, the senator had been working to advance the Worker Protection Act, a piece of legislation designed to protect employees from termination or retaliation when they rendered emergency assistance to persons in immediate danger. The bill had passed committee twice. Both times, corporate lobbying had killed it before a full floor vote. The lobbying money was organized, well-resourced, and drawn from a coalition of companies with significant financial interest in maintaining the current liability framework. Nexus Industrial Group was a named contributor to that coalition. Petra set a document on the table, a lobbying disclosure form, public record with Nexus's name and contribution amount highlighted. Daniel looked at it without touching it. "They fired you for saving my life," she said, "and they are actively funding the effort to ensure that the law never changes to prevent them from doing it again." She let that settle. "My father has been trying to put a human face on this issue for 4 years. Case studies, statistics, expert testimony, none of it has moved the people who need to be moved." She leaned forward slightly. "You would move them, not because you're exceptional, because you're exactly ordinary. Because what happened to you happens every day to people who don't have a senator's daughter sitting across from them." The word ordinary landed differently than she had probably intended it to. He thought about the 8 years and the 2 deployments and the 14 months of night shifts and the 3 years of solo parenting on a salary that required him to run multiplication tables in his head at the grocery store. He didn't say any of this. He understood what she meant, and she wasn't wrong. "What exactly are you asking for?" "A press conference. Your story told publicly with my father's legislation as context. Media coverage, interviews, visibility." She held his gaze. "I won't promise you it fixes everything. I can promise you I will not leave you in a worse position than the one you're in now." From the hallway, the small sound of Imani turning over in her sleep. The creak of the mattress, the faint whump of the stuffed elephant being repositioned. "I need to think about it," he said. She nodded as though she had expected this, and he understood that she probably had. She wrote her personal cell number on the inside cover of the leather folder and left it on the table when she stood. At the door, she paused. "The man who held the knife," she said. "The one you recognized. Did you tell the police you knew him?" "Not that night." She considered this. "Why not?" He thought about Troy Odom's eyes in the rain, the particular expression of a man who had arrived somewhere he hadn't planned to be. "Because it was complicated," he said, "and they didn't need the complication to do their job." She looked at him for a moment as though this answer had told her something she hadn't known she was trying to learn. Then she left. He called her the following morning, while Imani was at school and the apartment held its daytime quiet. He told her he was in. She said she would be there that afternoon with 2 colleagues. He made a fresh pot of coffee and straightened the kitchen, not for their benefit, but because the action of ordering a physical space was the closest thing he had to a preparation ritual. Sandra Voss arrived first, a woman in her mid-40s with silver-streaked hair cut close and the efficient bearing of someone who had spent decades in rooms where she was frequently the only person who had read all the relevant documents. She set a briefcase on the table, opened it, and had the Nexus employee handbook flagged to 2 different sections before anyone had finished the introductions. Derek Wills came in behind her, carrying a laptop and a tray of coffees from a shop down the street in the slightly over-caffeinated energy of someone whose natural resting state ran at about 70% higher than average. He was younger than Daniel had expected, early 30s, with the compact restlessness of a former journalist who had moved into consulting and still hadn't entirely made peace with the transition. Sandra read the relevant section of the employee handbook aloud without preamble. Section 14, Clause C. Employees rendering emergency assistance to persons in immediate danger of bodily harm are protected from disciplinary action. She looked up. They wrote this into their own policies. They violated their own policies. They then used footage of you demonstrating professional responsibility to justify the violation. Derek's laptop was already open. The framing for the press conference needs to be specific and personal, not abstract, not legislative. He looked at Daniel. You're not a spokesperson. You're a father who went to work and did the right thing and lost everything for it. We stay in that lane. Sandra set a legal pad on the table. I'm also filing a wrongful termination suit. The Good Samaritan clause makes it straightforward, but the suit takes time. The press conference moves faster. The 3 of them then began to talk to each other with the practiced efficiency of people who had worked together before. And Daniel sat at his own kitchen table and listened and occasionally answered direct questions. And the strange intimacy of having strangers occupy a space with such purposeful confidence settled over the apartment like a weather system that was not entirely unwelcome. Imani came home from school at 3:15, dropped her backpack on the floor, which Daniel redirected to its hook without breaking the thread of the conversation he was half following, and stood in the kitchen doorway looking at the 3 adults at her table with the expression of a 7-year-old conducting a rapid assessment. Her eyes moved to Petra. Are you the lady from TV? Petra looked up from her laptop. I'm not on TV. Baba said you were on the news. Imani considered this. Your shoes are nice. Petra looked down at her shoes. Thank you. How much did they cost? Daniel opened his mouth. Petra held up a hand that indicated she didn't need the intervention. More than they should have, Petra said. Imani absorbed this with the gravity of a judge weighing testimony. Baba only has 1 pair. She picked up her backpack from the floor and walked to her room without further comment. Derek watched her go. He looked at Daniel with an expression that was somewhere between amusement and something more serious. She's something. She's her mother, Daniel said. It came out simply without the weight he usually felt attached to the sentence. He noticed that and filed it. The days that followed had a particular texture. The texture of preparation, of a life temporarily reorganized around a single upcoming event while the ordinary concerns of that life pressed continuously at the perimeter. Imani's spelling test on Wednesday. The leaking faucet in the bathroom that had been leaking for 6 weeks. The antibiotics that were making the stitches itch in a way that required actual discipline not to aggravate. Petra was at the apartment most afternoons, working from Daniel's kitchen table with the unself-conscious focus of someone who had decided the space was functional and therefore sufficient. She brought her own coffee on the days when she arrived before noon. She did not make herself comfortable in the way of someone testing boundaries. She made herself useful in the way of someone who had assessed the situation and determined that usefulness was the appropriate mode. Imani warmed to her in the manner of a child who has decided to be cautious but is constitutionally unsuited to sustained wariness. Gradually, then visibly, then with the completeness that children sometimes achieve when they stop performing their skepticism and simply respond to what's in front of them. It started with the shoes, which Imani had apparently decided were an acceptable character indicator once her initial judgment was confirmed. It progressed to Petra sitting on the floor of the living room on a Tuesday evening helping with a social studies project about Maryland's Chesapeake Bay watershed, an event that Daniel observed from the hallway with a feeling he couldn't immediately classify and decided temporarily not to examine. One evening, late, after Imani was asleep and Sandra and Derek had gone home and Petra was gathering the documents spread across the table, she asked about the watch. He was washing the cups at the sink. He didn't answer immediately, and she didn't repeat the question, which was one of the things he had noticed about her. She asked questions and then gave them room, didn't press them like an accelerator. "My wife," he said finally. "She had it engraved before she died. I didn't know about the inscription until the funeral." Petra set down the folder she was holding. "I wear it every day," he said. Not because she had asked why, because it was the next true thing. "What does it say?" he told her. She was quiet for a moment in the way that certain silences were quiet, not empty, not waiting to be filled, but simply present. "She knew you," Petra said. It was not a question. It was the most accurate thing anyone had said about Angela to him in 3 years. And it landed in a place behind his sternum with a weight that was not grief exactly. Or not only grief. Something more complex, something that contained grief the way a river contained its source, as part of its nature but not its totality. He didn't say anything. He dried his hands and turned off the faucet. She picked up her folder again. The moment passed into the ordinary fabric of the evening without fanfare, which was exactly the right place for it to go. 8 days before the press conference, at 11:47 at night, Imani began to wheeze. Daniel was at the table with his laptop open, reviewing the statement Derek had drafted for the press conference, when he heard the change in her breathing through the cracked door. He had learned in the years since her diagnosis to hear that sound the way some people heard a smoke alarm, not as background information but as a signal that overrode everything else in his sensory field. He was in her doorway in 4 seconds. She was sitting up in bed, her small chest working harder than it should. The elephant pressed against her stomach. She looked at him with eyes that were not panicked. She had been through this before and she knew what it was, but alert in the way of someone who has identified a problem and is waiting for the person responsible for solving it to arrive. He went to the nightstand. The inhaler was there. He picked it up, shook it the way the pharmacist had shown him, held it out. It was empty. He knew it wasn't supposed to be empty. He had checked it 4 days ago, and it had had enough for at least a week. But it was empty, and the refill he had planned to pick up tomorrow morning was sitting in a system at a CVS 3 blocks away, and it was 11:47 at night, and Imani was wheezing. He wrapped her in her blanket, carried her to the truck. She was old enough to walk, but he carried her because it was faster, and because the weight of her in his arms was a kind of information he needed in moments like this, the physical fact of her solidity, and drove to the CVS on Federal Street with the speed of someone who knew which lights he could push and which he couldn't. The pharmacist was a young man who looked tired in the particular way of someone reaching the end of a long shift, and he pulled up the prescription and scanned the insurance card and entered the data and looked at his screen with the expression of someone who was about to say something he didn't want to say. The claim had been flagged. An overdraft on the account, a processing error from 3 days ago when an automatic payment had triggered a fee that had cascaded into a temporary account suspension. The card was blocked. Daniel checked his wallet, $11 in cash, The prescription was $138. He stood at the pharmacy counter with $11 in his wallet and his daughter on his hip, and the understanding, arriving with the terrible clarity of a diagnosis, that this was the bottom. This was the actual floor. He had been managing for 3 years. He had been running calculations and accepting help from Ruth and working nights and cutting every expenditure that could be cut, and he had managed always by the margin that mattered, the minimum required to keep Imani safe and cared for, and unaware of exactly how close the margins actually were. And now he was standing at a pharmacy counter at 11:53 at night, and the margin was $11. And his daughter was wheezing into the blanket against his shoulder. He called Ruth. The phone rang twice, then her voice, sleep-roughened and immediately alert in the way of someone who had spent decades answering phones in the night for people who needed things. He told her where he was, he told her the situation. He did not dress it up or understate it, because Ruth had known him long enough and Angela long enough that neither would have been served by either. She arrived in 9 minutes. She came through the CVS door in her coat pulled over her nightgown, moving with the unhurried urgency of a woman who had learned that speed was a byproduct of efficiency, not its replacement. She found him at the pharmacy counter with Imani on his hip and pressed a folded envelope into his hand. Without ceremony. $200, she said. I keep it in my coat. Old habit from Harold's last year. You never know when the night needs money. She looked at him steadily. Don't you say anything to me about it? The something he wanted to say, the refusal, the self-sufficiency, the pride that Angela had called his most exhausting quality on at least 3 specific occasions, stayed exactly where it was. He looked at Ruth's face, at the pragmatic, unperformative love in it, and he did the thing that had taken him 3 years to learn to do without it costing him something. He took the envelope. Thank you, he said. Nothing more. She nodded as though he had said exactly the right thing. He paid for the prescription. He administered the inhaler in the parking lot with Imani sitting on the hood of the truck wrapped in her blanket, the Baltimore night around them. The CVS parking lot lights casting their flat orange glow over the row of shopping carts and the empty handicap spaces and the strip of scrubby grass at the lot's edge. Within 12 minutes, her breathing had smoothed out. She leaned against his chest and looked up at the orange sky. Baba. Her voice was small and clear, the wheeze almost gone. I'm here. Are you scared? He thought about the honest answer and the useful answer and whether in this particular moment they were the same answer. A little, he said, but it's okay to be scared and still take care of things. She considered this. Mom used to say that being scared just means you care about what happens. He held her a little tighter. He did not trust his voice for a moment. Ruth stood a few feet away with her coat wrapped around her and her arms crossed, looking out at Federal Street with the patience of someone who understood when to be present without being intrusive. When Imani was breathing normally and had begun to show signs of imminent sleep, Ruth walked over and put one hand on Daniel's shoulder from behind. You're going to be all right, she said, and it was not the empty reassurance of someone trying to make him feel better. It was a statement of observed fact from a woman who had watched him carry this weight for 3 years and had her own reasons for believing in the carrying. He drove home with Imani asleep in the back seat. He sat in the parked truck for a few minutes after he turned the engine off, in the quiet of the interior, with the orange-lit windshield and the sound of the city outside. He looked at the watch, the inscription that Angela had put there because she had known, in the way that people who love you sometimes know the things you need to be told before you know you need to hear them. He picked up his phone and called Petra. She answered on the second ring. He heard the particular quality of someone's silence when they have been awake and waiting, not surprised by the call, waiting for it. I'm ready, he said. The hotel conference room held 60 people, which was 60 more than Daniel had ever addressed at one time on any subject. The chairs were filled before the doors closed. Camera operators lined the back wall with the organized efficiency of people who had set up and broken down rigs in hundreds of rooms like this one. The morning light came in from the bank of windows on the south wall and turned the space a particular quality of gray gold that made everything look slightly more significant than it was, which was perhaps the point. Senator Harlow opened the proceedings. He was taller than he looked on yard signs, with the careful cadence of a man who had learned that the space between words was as important as the words themselves, and he spoke about the Worker Protection Act with the controlled passion of someone who had said the same things many times and had not yet stopped believing them. Petra came to the podium next. She described the night at the warehouse in the flat, declarative sentences of someone reporting rather than performing. What she had seen, what she had heard, what she had felt when the hand went over her mouth and she had understood that the situation was entirely beyond her management. Her voice was steady except for a moment at the end, when she said that she had heard a voice in the dark, telling the men to stop, and that the voice had sounded like someone for whom stopping was not a request but an instruction. She paused there. The room was entirely quiet. Daniel walked onto the stage with Imani's hand in his right hand. He hadn't planned that. She had appeared at his side when he was standing in the wings and had simply taken his hand, with the matter-of-fact purposefulness of someone who had assessed the situation and determined her position. He had looked down at her and she had looked up at him with a small nod of the head that was so specifically Angela that his chest had contracted. He stood at the podium. He looked out at the room. "My name is Daniel Reeves." He let the sentence stand by itself for a moment. "I served 8 years in the Army. I did 2 tours in Afghanistan and came home with a shoulder that doesn't work right in cold weather and a habit of checking every room I walk into for exits." A few people in the audience shifted. "I'm not going to talk about that part very long. I mention it only because it's the reason I can run towards something scary instead of away from it. The Army didn't give me courage. It gave me the habit of not wasting time evaluating my own fear when someone else's problem is more urgent." He told them about the shift, the mop in the corridor and the rain against the warehouse roof, the sound that had come through the wall of noise and the way his body had moved before his mind had fully formed the decision. He told them about the stitches and the paperwork and walking home in the dawn. He told them about sitting at the kitchen table with the numbers on the notepad and the tickets to Portland that weren't going to get used. He told them about the pharmacy parking lot. He told it plainly without performing the vulnerability of it, which made it land harder than performance would have. The $11 in his wallet and his daughter wheezing into a blanket and the neighbor's envelope and the orange light over the empty shopping carts. "I don't tell you that because I want your sympathy." He looked directly at the cameras. "I tell you because that is what doing the right thing cost me. And I want you to understand that I would do it again. Not because I'm extraordinary. Because that is what we are supposed to do when someone needs help. That is the baseline. That should not be a fireable offense." He stepped back from the podium. The applause began in the middle rows and moved outward. Imani looked up at him with the expression of someone whose hypothesis had been confirmed. "They clapped," she said with the tone of scientific reporting. He put his hand on top of her head. "Yeah, they did." By that evening, the clip had been viewed 400,000 times. By midnight, the number had crossed 2 million. Daniel knew this because Derek was texting him updates with a frequency that suggested Derek had set up some kind of monitoring alert, and because Petra called at 9 to tell him to stop reading the comments, which meant she had been reading them and had information about what was in them that she was choosing to curate on his behalf. He appreciated the curation. He did not follow the advice. The comments were what they were, a cross-section of human response to a story that had touched something real in a significant number of people, with the small percentage of ugliness that attached itself to any visible target. He read what he needed to read to understand the shape of what had happened, and then he put the phone down and went to check on Imani. She was asleep. He stood in the doorway in the dark, listening. 3 days later, the first counter-narrative appeared. It was not on a major network. It appeared first on 2 financial blogs and then on a podcast that described itself as covering corporate responsibility from a balanced perspective, which in practice meant it gave platforms to corporate communications officials without the burden of adversarial questioning. The narrative was simple. Daniel Reeves had a disciplinary record at Nexus. He had been cited once for tardiness. He had received a verbal warning 6 months into his tenure about attitude during a shift briefing. The tardiness had been the morning after Imani's first significant asthma hospitalization. He had arrived 22 minutes late because he had been at the hospital until 4 in the morning and had not had anyone to call to cover the morning routine and had missed the bus. He had not told Gary why. He had simply accepted the citation because the energy required to explain felt like the wrong use of whatever was left in him that morning. The verbal warning had come from a shift supervisor named Keith Pruitt, who had been terminated from Nexus 8 months later following an internal investigation into harassment complaints from 3 different employees on his shift. None of the accounts of Daniel's disciplinary history mentioned Keith Pruitt's subsequent termination. He found all of this out from Sandra, who had been monitoring the counter-narrative with the methodical attention of someone who had seen this playbook before and knew its standard sequence. She called him on a Friday afternoon with the particular calm of someone delivering information she wants you to receive without the distortion of her own reaction to it. "They're trying to complicate the story," she said, "make you a flawed employee rather than a wronged one. The details they're using are technically accurate and substantively misleading, which is the most effective kind of dishonesty." A pause. "It will get louder before it stops." It got louder. By the following Tuesday, Imani came home from school and sat at the kitchen table with her backpack still on and told Daniel, in the measured voice of someone reporting an unpleasant event that they have decided to treat as data rather than injury, that a boy in her class had told her his mother had seen the news and said that Daniel was the kind of person who causes trouble. Daniel sat down across from her. He looked at his daughter's face, the careful composure of it, the way she was watching him to see how he handled the information before she decided how she was going to feel about it. "That boy's mother doesn't know me," he said. "I know." Imani's chin was steady. "I told him you were the kind of person who finishes his shift after someone stabs him. He didn't have anything to say to that." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. She turned her hand over and held his back. That evening, he sat in the kitchen after she was asleep and thought seriously about what Petra had told him from the beginning. That he could step back at any point and she would handle the rest. The offer was real, he knew that. And the cost of continuing was not only the things being said about him, it was this. The 7-year-old at the table with her backpack still on, absorbing impact that was meant for him. He was close to making the call when his doorbell rang at 8:43. Gary Novak was standing in the hallway in jeans and a gray jacket, holding a manila envelope in both hands the way a person held something they had decided to stop holding on to. He didn't ask to come in. He stood in the doorway and said he had been trying to do this for 3 weeks and had not been able to until tonight, and that he did not expect anything from Daniel in return, not forgiveness or gratitude or conversation, and that he would leave the envelope and go if Daniel wanted. Daniel let him in. Gary sat in one of the kitchen chairs and set the envelope on the table. Inside were printed emails, internal Nexus correspondence showing that the decision to terminate Daniel had been prepared by the company's legal department 48 hours before the meeting in Gary's office. Gary had received the instruction the morning of that meeting, 2 hours before Daniel arrived. The termination had been decided before Gary knew what footage existed. Gary had been given a script and an envelope and a time. "I was going to just follow it," Gary said, looking at the table. "I told myself I didn't have a choice, that it was above me." That the company would do what it was going to do with or without my signature. He was quiet for a moment. I watched your press conference. I watched what you said about finishing the shift. He moved the envelope slightly, a small adjustment without apparent purpose. I've been in that job for 11 years. I've signed a lot of things I told myself I didn't choose. He had a second document in the envelope. The employment records for Troy Odom, the contract, the termination paperwork, the notation from HR acknowledging that the 2-week severance payment specified in the contract had not been issued, flagged as a processing oversight, never corrected. And beneath that, a copy of the original hiring paperwork, which included a background check that had flagged a misdemeanor assault charge from 9 years ago. The check had been approved by legal with a notation. Risk acceptable given contract rate differential. Nexus had known about Troy's history. They had hired him because he was cheaper than a licensed security professional. They had fired him without paying what they owed, and then they had fired the man who had dealt with the consequences of those two decisions. Daniel looked at the documents for a long time. He looked at Gary, who was still looking at the table with the expression of a man who had chosen something tonight that he hadn't chosen in 11 years, and was sitting with what that cost. "Why tonight?" Daniel asked. Gary looked up. "Because my daughter asked me what I did at work." His voice was level but only just. And I started to answer and I couldn't finish the sentence. Daniel picked up the phone and called Sandra. Then he called Petra. "We continue," he said when she answered. "All of it." Her voice on the other end had something in it that was not relief exactly. Something that had been waiting to hear this particular answer and was now allowing itself to settle. The documents went to Sandra that night. By morning she had drafted the amended complaint. By afternoon she had filed it. The story had changed shape. It was no longer only about one man being fired for saving one woman. It was about a company that had manufactured the conditions for the attack, profited from the cheapness of those conditions, and then penalized the person who had walked into the consequence. Daniel sat at the kitchen table that night after everything had quieted, the apartment dark except for the lamp in the corner, and thought about the pharmacy parking lot and the $11 and the envelope from Ruth's coat. He thought about Gary sitting across from him, with the expression of a man stepping out of a version of himself that had fit badly for a long time. He turned the watch over in his hand, the crack in the crystal, the inscription underneath. He put it back on his wrist and went to bed. Tomorrow there was work to do. Sandra filed the amended complaint on a Monday. By Wednesday, Nexus Industrial Group's stock had dropped an additional 9 points. By Friday, the financial press had stopped covering it as a labor dispute and started covering it as a governance failure, which was a different category of story with a different category of consequence, the kind that made board members check their calendars and start returning calls they had previously delegated. Daniel knew the numbers because Derek sent him updates the way a doctor sent lab results, regularly without editorializing, trusting the recipient to contextualize. He read them at the kitchen table each morning before Imani woke up, with the coffee and the particular stillness of the apartment before 7. And he processed them with the same detachment he had learned to apply to incoming information in situations where the information was real. But the appropriate response was not yet clear. 3 board members resigned in 72 hours. The sequence was not simultaneous. One went first and the other 2 followed in the way that certain decisions required a precedent before they could be made. Each resignation making the next one easier by demonstrating that the door existed and could be walked through. Frank Delacroix issued a statement saying the company was committed to a thorough review of its employment practices and would be implementing comprehensive policy changes in the coming months. The statement was written in the specific language of institutional damage control. Passive constructions. No subject taking direct ownership of any verb, every sentence technically true and cumulatively meaning nothing. Daniel read it once and didn't read it again. The Worker Protection Act moved through the Senate committee on a Tuesday afternoon. Daniel watched the vote streaming on his laptop in the small office he had been using at the Veterans Organization on Pratt Street, where Senator Harlow had arranged temporary workspace. A desk, a chair, a window that looked out on a parking structure, and a door he could close when the phone rang too many times in an hour. Imani was doing homework on the couch against the wall, her backpack open beside her, her feet tucked under her with the boneless ease of a child entirely comfortable in her body. The final committee tally appeared on the screen. Daniel sat back. Imani looked up from her worksheet. She read his face the way she had always read his face, not the surface of it, the layer underneath. Did it pass? Committee. Senate floor vote is next week. She nodded with the gravity of someone who understood the distinction between a battle and a campaign. She had learned this distinction, he suspected, not from anything he had explicitly taught her, but from watching the shape of the last several weeks, the way progress arrived in increments and not in the single decisive moment that stories made it look like. She went back to her worksheet. He looked at the screen a moment longer, then closed the laptop. The Senate floor vote passed 2 weeks later. The House took another 3 weeks with the particular friction of a chamber that moved at the pace of its most reluctant members. But it passed. Daniel was not in Washington when either vote happened. He was in Baltimore, at the Veterans Organization, doing the work that the organization existed to do, which was the work that had become, in the months since the press conference, the primary shape of his days. Senator Harlow had offered him the directorship of the Veterans Reintegration Program formally, in a meeting in the senator's Baltimore office that had the slightly unreal quality of being one of those moments whose significance you could see while you were in it rather than only in retrospect. Daniel had asked for 48 hours to think about it. He had spent those 48 hours doing what he always did with major decisions, running the parameters, testing the objections, sitting with the discomfort of wanting something he wasn't certain he deserved. The program worked with veterans navigating the civilian transition, the employment gap, the credential mismatch, the particular psychic cost of leaving a structure that had organized your entire identity and finding yourself in a world that didn't have a slot for what you had become. Daniel knew this territory intimately. Not from a clinical distance, but from the inside of it, from the years of learning that the Army had trained him for everything except the absence of the Army. He called the senator on the second day and accepted the position. The senator said something about purpose and legacy that Daniel appreciated without fully inhabiting, because he was not, at this stage of his life, particularly interested in his legacy. He was interested in whether the work was real and whether he could do it, and whether it would let him be home when Imani got home from school. The answer to all three was yes. The first veteran he met in his new capacity was a woman named Denise Calloway, who arrived for her intake appointment on a Thursday morning wearing the expression of someone who had agreed to attend a thing they had already decided would be useless. She was 38, former Army intelligence analyst, 14 years of service ending in a medical separation following a knee injury sustained during her second deployment. She had been in Baltimore for 2 years. She had worked 3 jobs, moved twice, and filed the paperwork for a divorce that had been finalized 4 months ago. She sat across from Daniel's desk and looked at him with the flat assessment of someone who had been assessed enough times themselves to recognize when it was being done to them. "You're the guy from the news," she said. "Yeah." "The janitor. I was a janitor. Now I'm this." He gestured at the desk without particular ceremony. "It's a lateral move in terms of glamour." Something shifted almost imperceptibly in her expression. Not quite amusement, but the involuntary softening that happens when someone says something unexpected. He did not open her file. He had read it before she arrived, read it carefully, the way he read everything he needed to understand before a conversation rather than during it. And he set it to the side now because he had found, in the first weeks of this work, that the file was the least useful thing in the room. The file was what the person had done and what had happened to them. It was not who they were or what they needed or what they were afraid of asking for. "What did you love about the work?" he asked. "Not what you were good at, what you actually loved." The question landed differently than she had expected. He could see the recalibration. She had come prepared for a different kind of conversation, one with a template and a rubric, and this question didn't fit the template. "Purpose," she said after a pause that was not evasion but genuine consideration. "Knowing that the information I gathered had a direct line to someone's safety, that the work connected to something real." She looked at the middle distance. "I haven't felt that since I got out. Everything civilian feels like I'm operating one step removed from anything that actually matters." "How long have you been feeling that?" 2 years. A beat. Longer, probably. I just didn't have a word for it until I got out, and it was the only thing I felt. He leaned forward slightly. "I'm not going to give you a resume workshop. I'm not going to help you translate military experience into civilian language, because that framing assumes the civilian language is the standard you should be translating toward." He watched her face. "What I want to do is figure out what you're actually trying to accomplish and work backward from there. Not from your file. From you." She looked at him for a moment with the particular wariness of someone who has learned that offers of genuine help are frequently the setup for a disappointment. "Why does it matter to you?" It was a fair question, and he gave it the answer it deserved. "Because 3 years ago I was sitting where you're sitting. Not this chair, not this room, but that feeling. The one where you can see clearly what you've lost and can't see at all what comes next." He held her gaze. "Nobody translated anything for me. Somebody just asked me the right question at the right time. That's the only thing I have to offer. I'm going to try to ask the right questions." Denise Calloway came back the following week, and the week after that. 3 months later, she enrolled in a master's program in clinical counseling with a specialization in veteran mental health. She sent Daniel a card on her first day of classes. A plain white card. 3 sentences in tight handwriting that said she had not believed when she walked into his office that anything in that room would be different from the 17 other intake appointments she had attended since getting out, and that she had been wrong, and that she wanted him to know it. He pinned the card to the wall above his desk. It was the first thing he hung in the office. Everything else went up around it. The signing ceremony was held in the East Room of the White House on a Wednesday in October, which was the kind of sentence that Daniel turned over several times in his head, in the days before it happened, without it becoming less strange. He had been to Washington twice before, once on a school trip in 7th grade and once for a Veterans Affairs hearing that Senator Harlow had asked him to attend as a witness 3 months after the press conference. Neither visit had prepared him for the specific quality of the East Room, which was large in a way that was not about size but about intention, every architectural decision having been made to communicate the gravity of what happened there. Imani was in her green dress. She had chosen it herself from the 3 options Ruth had laid out on the bed the night before, selected it with the decisive confidence of someone who understood that this was a significant occasion and had opinions about how significant occasions should be dressed for. She was carrying the elephant, which had been granted special dispensation from its usual stay-at-home policy on the grounds that, as Imani had explained to Daniel with complete seriousness, he had been there for everything and deserved to see how it ended. Senator Harlow was near the front, standing with the contained satisfaction of someone who had spent 4 years on a thing and was watching it complete. Petra was somewhere in the room behind Daniel. He had spoken to her briefly in the hallway before the ceremony, a short exchange about logistics that had contained underneath its practical surface the particular warmth of 2 people who had been through something together and were on the other side of it. An aide touched Daniel's elbow and guided him to a position to the left of the podium. He stood there while the president spoke, And he listened to the words about courage and workers and the principle that doing the right thing should not be a liability. And he felt the strange doubling of being both inside and outside an event simultaneously, present in the physical fact of it, removed from it by the surreality of hearing his own name in this room, in this context, attached to this legislation. The aide had told him the bill was being called the Reeves Amendment. He had raised this with Senator Harlow 2 weeks ago, making the case that his name on the legislation was unnecessary and potentially counterproductive, that the principle mattered more than the association. The senator had listened and then told him without particular heat that the name had been chosen by the bill's co-sponsors based on their read of what would make the legislation legible to the public, and that Daniel was welcome to continue objecting in principle while accepting the practical reality. He had accepted the practical reality. The president signed the bill. The pen moved across the paper with the small ceremony of a thing becoming official, and the room responded with the applause that rooms like this produced at moments like this, not spontaneous but genuine, the kind of applause that comes from people who have been working towards something and are now marking its arrival. Imani tugged his sleeve. "Baba." Her voice was low for the room. He looked down at her. "Mom would be proud," she said, not as a comfort, as an observation delivered with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone reporting a condition that they had assessed and confirmed. He put his arm around her shoulders and pulled her against his side. He could not speak for a moment, which she accepted without commentary, leaning into him with the easy weight of a child who had learned that presence was sometimes the whole of what was needed. He found Dorothy Harlow in the hallway outside the East Room, sitting in her wheelchair with the upright carriage of someone for whom physical limitation had never been permitted to become a posture. She was 89 years old and had the eyes of someone who had been paying close attention for all of them. Petra was crouched beside the chair in conversation with her grandmother, and when she saw Daniel approach, she straightened and moved aside in the way of someone making room for a conversation they understood was not theirs. Dorothy Harlow extended her hand. He took it. Her grip was light but deliberate, the grip of someone who shook hands as an act of assessment. "Senator Harlow's mother," he said, "and Petra's grandmother." Among other things, her voice was thin but clear, the consonants precise. "I have been watching you for several months, Mr. Reeves, from what I can see through a television screen, which is a limited instrument, and from what my granddaughter has told me, which is a better one." He waited. "My husband served in Korea," she said. "My son served in the Gulf. I have spent most of my adult life in the company of men and women who were trained to run toward dangerous things, and I want to tell you something that most of them were never told." She paused, and the pause had the quality of someone who had earned the right to take their time. "The moment you ran toward that woman in the dark was not the moment you became who you are. It was the moment you discovered who you had already been for a very long time." Daniel felt the sentence land in the way that certain true things landed, not as news but as recognition, the experience of hearing articulated something you had known in a way that hadn't yet been available to language. "Courage isn't the instant of action," she continued. "It's the accumulated weight of every small choice before it. Every time you didn't look away, didn't take the easier path, didn't let the hard thing be someone else's problem. You don't build that in a crisis. You build it in the ordinary days, and then one night it's just there, already made, waiting to be used." He thought about the 900-some nights of making breakfast and checking inhalers and running the numbers at the kitchen table and getting up again. He thought about Afghanistan and the way the army had not made him brave but had made him practiced, and about Angela, who had taken that practice and shown him what it was actually for. "Thank you," he said. He meant it with a specificity that the word rarely carried. Dorothy Harlow released his hand, with a small nod that concluded the conversation without diminishing it. Petra appeared at his side as he turned, and they walked back toward the east room together, not speaking, in the comfortable silence of people who have run out of things to perform for each other. 3 weeks after the signing ceremony, Frank Delacroix appeared at the door of Daniel's office on Pratt Street. He had called the office line the day before, spoken to the receptionist, left a message that said only that he would like to speak with Mr. Reeves if Mr. Reeves was willing, and that he would understand if the answer was no. Daniel had told the receptionist to tell him to come at 2 on Thursday. Delacroix arrived at 1:58. He was wearing a jacket and dark pants, not a suit, the deliberate not suit of a man who had decided that arriving in corporate armor would be the wrong read of the situation. He was smaller than Daniel had imagined from the photographs in the financial press, softer, without the authority of the position that had previously organized his presence. He sat in the chair across the desk and looked at the wall of cards and letters behind Daniel without comment. Then he looked at Daniel. "I'm not here to manage anything," he said. "I've resigned. The board accepted it 3 weeks ago. There's nothing left to manage." He set his hands flat on his knees. "I came because I owe you something that can't be delivered through a press release or a settlement agreement." Daniel waited. "I was a mechanical engineer," Delacroix said, 26 years old, working for a shipping components manufacturer in Wilmington. "I liked the work. I was good at it." He looked at his hands. "The company got acquired. The new ownership wanted a different kind of management. People who understood that the primary language of every decision was cost reduction. I was promoted because I was willing to learn that language." A pause that was not dramatic but effortful. The pause of someone finding their way through something they hadn't said before. "I told myself for 20 years that I was doing what the system required, that the decisions I signed were above my level and below my level and therefore not exactly mine." He looked up. "I watched your press conference, the part where you talked about finishing the shift, about what you were supposed to do being the same as what you chose to do." His voice thinned slightly. "I haven't been able to locate those two things on the same axis for a very long time." The office was quiet. From the hallway came the muffled sounds of the organization's ordinary operations. A phone, a door, a conversation at a register that was too low to parse. "I don't want anything from you," Delacroix said. "Not forgiveness, not absolution. I'm not here for my benefit." He reached into his jacket pocket and placed a folded check on the desk. "This is a personal contribution to the program. Not from Nexus, not from their foundation. From me." He stood. "I also wanted you to know that I've spent the last 3 weeks contacting every employee whose termination I signed in the last 5 years and asking them to submit their cases for review under the new amendment. Some of them won't qualify. Some of them will. Either way, it was the first thing I've done in a long time that I didn't have to talk myself into." Daniel looked at the check on the desk. He looked at Delacroix. "I appreciate you coming," he said. "What you just described, the 20 years of telling yourself the decisions were above and below you, that's the thing the amendment is actually about. Not the people who act badly on purpose. The people who stop acting at all because the system makes it easier not to." He held the man's gaze. "You know who you are now. Figure out what to do with that." Delacroix nodded. He extended his hand and Daniel shook it. The man left and Daniel sat alone in his office for a few minutes with the check on the desk and the wall of cards behind him. And he thought about the way that people arrived at their own reckonings on their own schedules, and how the only useful response to someone else's reckoning was to take it seriously and not require it to look like yours. He put the check in the program's donation envelope and went back to work. The day Daniel put Imani on the train was a Saturday in early July. 8 weeks after the signing ceremony and exactly 12 months and 4 days after the night at the warehouse. He had opened the kitchen drawer that morning without planning to. He had been looking for the roll of packing tape and had found the 2 expired Amtrak tickets sitting where they had always been. The originals. The ones from 5 months of $11 weekly savings. The ones that had become over the course of the year a kind of marker. He held them for a moment. They had no practical value. They were not refundable. They were not in any material sense anything. He put them in his shirt pocket. The new tickets were already on his phone. 2 seats on the 9:45 from Penn Station, Baltimore to Portland, Maine, purchased 2 weeks ago at the regular fare, which he had been able to pay for with the ordinary ease of a man whose financial situation had been permanently altered by the events of the past year, and who was still, honestly, in the process of adjusting to what ordinary ease felt like. Imani had packed her own bag the night before with the thorough independence of a child who considered parental assistance in this area an implication she wasn't prepared to accept. She had included 3 books, her drawing supplies, a sandwich in a Ziploc bag because she did not fully trust train food, and the elephant, who traveled now with the seasoned air of someone who had attended a White House signing ceremony and considered domestic train journeys a comparatively relaxed proposition. Ruth had come over at 8:30 to see them off. She had brought coffee for Daniel and a small wrapped package for Imani, which turned out to contain a new set of colored pencils. A specific brand that Imani had mentioned wanting 3 months ago. The kind of small attentiveness that Ruth practiced with the consistency of someone who understood that love was primarily logistical. Imani held the pencils against her chest the whole way to the station. Penn Station in the morning had the particular energy of departures, the organized urgency of people who knew where they were going, the rolling luggage and the checking of phones and the specific quality of anticipation that gathered in public spaces where people were in transit between one version of their life and another. Daniel carried both bags and Imani walked beside him, close enough that their arms touched with each step. They found their car, found their seats, window and aisle, Imani taking the window without discussion, which was as it should be. The car filled gradually around them. The conductor moved through with the unhurried competence of someone who had made this trip many hundreds of times and maintained a relationship with it that was neither bored nor performed. The train left on time. Baltimore receded outside the window, the city's industrial edge, the harbor visible for a moment in the gap between buildings, the long grass beside the tracks bending in the wake of the train's passage. Imani had her forehead nearly against the glass, watching with the absolute focus of someone encountering something new. Daniel sat back. He was not thinking about the amendment or the organization or the stack of intake files on his desk or the speaking invitation from a labor conference in Chicago that he hadn't yet answered. He was thinking about nothing in a way that was unfamiliar. Not the nothing of exhaustion, which had been his primary experience of mental stillness for most of the last 3 years, but the nothing of genuine rest. The particular quiet that comes when the thing you have been braced for has passed and the bracing can be set down. His left hand moved to the watch, the reflex of 3 years and 4 months, the reaching for the thing that grounded him when the ground was uncertain. He turned it over in his fingers without taking it off. He thought about Angela, not the last months of her, not the hospital and the weight she lost and the morning she asked him to open the bedroom curtains and then watched the light for a long time without speaking. He thought about her before that, the woman who had grown up 8 blocks from where they lived and had come home to it with the uncomplicated love of someone who didn't need a place to be exceptional in order to belong to it. The woman who had told him during an argument that had been about something small and was actually about something large, that his insistence on carrying everything alone wasn't strength. It was just a more socially acceptable form of refusing help. The woman who had known, as she approached the end of her life, that he would need a reminder he could wear on his wrist. He understood the inscription differently now than he had understood it on the morning he first read it. He had understood it then as an instruction for moments of crisis. Run toward the thing that scares you, run toward the sound in the dark. That reading was accurate. It was also incomplete. Running toward it was not only about the warehouse and the rain and the knife. It was about the pharmacy parking lot. It was about Gary Novak's manila envelope. It was about Denise Calloway sitting across the desk with her arms crossed and her mind already halfway out the door. It was about sitting in this seat on this train, watching his daughter's breath fog the window, not braced, not calculating, just present in the fact of her. Angela had not written the inscription to tell him how to face danger. She had written it to tell him how to face everything. "Baba." Imani's voice came from the window, her eyes still on the passing Maryland landscape. "Do you think Grandma Josephine is going to cry?" Angela's mother, Josephine, who had moved to Maine because the city had become unbearable and had been in Maine for 3 years without seeing her granddaughter. "Probably," he said. "Is it okay if I cry too?" "Yeah, absolutely." She nodded, satisfied, and returned to the window. A few minutes passed in the pleasant non-demand of the moving train. She said without turning, "I miss Mom more when good things happen than when bad things happen. Is that weird?" He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I think when bad things happen, you're too busy to feel much of anything. When good things happen, you have room for it." She thought about this. "Yeah." A pause. "I wish she could see the stuff that's happening." "Me too." He looked at the watch. "I think she does, though, in whatever way that works." Imani turned from the window and looked at him directly, with the full attention that she reserved for questions she had been sitting with for a while. "Do you think she'd be okay with Petra?" He had been waiting for this question, or a version of it, for several months. He had not known, when it arrived, whether he would know the answer. He found that he did. "I think she would have liked Petra for the same reasons I do," he said, "and I think she would have been glad I wasn't doing everything alone." Imani absorbed this. She appeared after a moment to reach a conclusion that satisfied her, and she turned back to the window with the decisive quality of someone closing a chapter. The train moved north through Maryland, through the edges of Delaware, into the particular green of the Northeast Corridor in summer. The car around them had settled into the comfortable anonymity of people in transit, each occupied with their own version of the distance between where they had been and where they were going. Imani drew in her sketchbook, something involving the landscape he could see from the angle, her pencil moving with the focused ease of a child who had inherited her mother's instinct for capturing a thing before it passed. At some point, she fell asleep. The sketchbook slid from her hands and he caught it before it hit the floor, looked at what she'd been drawing. A train window. Outside the window, a landscape with a river in it. Inside the window reflected 2 figures, a tall one and a small one side by side, slightly blurred the way reflections are blurred. She had drawn them from the outside looking in, which was not the perspective she had been sitting in, which meant she had been imagining how they looked to the world passing by. He set the sketchbook on the seat beside her. He looked out the window at the landscape she had drawn. The river was the Susquehanna, he thought, though he wasn't certain, the water bright in the morning light. He put his hand on the watch, turned it the way he always turned it. He did not read the inscription. He had it memorized. He had had it memorized since the morning outside the church when Angela's sister pressed the box into his hands, and in 3 years and 4 months the words had become part of the internal architecture of the way he moved through the world, present whether he named them or not, structural, load-bearing. The train went north. He let his head rest against the seat back. He closed his eyes. He was not bracing for anything. Outside the window, the country moved past in the green and gold of an ordinary summer morning, full of people who were running toward things and away from things and standing still and beginning and ending. And in the middle of all of it, a man with a cracked watch on his wrist and a sleeping daughter beside him was simply moving forward, which was, when you stripped everything else away, the whole of what was required. It was enough. It had always been enough.